Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio Network. Educate, enlightened, entertained. A wholly owned subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. And today on Lest, with a T, We Forget, hosts Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurtzel, and Lillian Cauldwell will discuss for the last episode of the U.S. and the Holocaust about the U.S. and the Japanese and how they treated them and what they did to them and the effect 50, 60 years later.
So while we were dealing with the Holocaust situation during World War II in Europe and the Depression here in the United States, there was another situation brewing that a lot of us actually are not even aware of. So lest we forget about the Japanese internment camps during the same period of time. The Japanese internment camps were put into place starting in 1942 and ended with the ending of World War II in 1945. And this is the story. Japanese American internment. It was the forced relocation by the U.S. government of thousands of Japanese Americans to detention camps during World War II. That action was a culmination of the federal government's long history of racist and discriminatory treatment of Asian immigrants and their descendants that had begun with restrictive immigration policies in the late 1800s. We talked about that in, I think, our second episode, where in 1882, they disallowed any Chinese people from immigrating to the United States. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japanese aircraft on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. War Department suspected that Japanese Americans might act as saboteurs or espionage agents, despite a lack of hard evidence to support that view. Some political leaders recommended rounding up Japanese Americans, particularly those living along the West Coast, and placing them in detention centers inland. A power struggle erupted between the U.S. Department of Justice, which opposed moving innocent civilians, and the War Department, which favored the detention. On March 18, 1942, the Federal War Relocation Authority, the acronym is WRA, was established to take all people of Japanese descent into custody, surround them with troops, prevent them from buying land, and return them to their former homes at the close of the war. This collection, So the Japanese internment camps were established during World War II by ours truly, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, through his Executive Order 9066. From 1942 to 1945, it was the policy of the U.S. government that people of Japanese descent, including U.S. citizens, would be incarcerated in these isolated camps, enacted in reaction to the Pearl Harbor attacks and the ensuing war. The incarceration of Japanese Americans is considered one of the most atrocious violations of American civil rights in the 20th century. And this is the entire reason why it's not everyday news. We don't hear about it. And as the baby boomers age and the Depression era generation fades away, the memories of the Japanese internment camps goes right with them. So we're going to resurrect it here. So on February 19th, 1942, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japanese forces, President Roosevelt signed that executive order with the stated. And then on February 19th, 1942, he gave the U.S. military authority to exclude any persons from designated areas. This is interesting, although the word Japanese did not appear in the executive order, it was clear that only Japanese Americans were targeted, though some other immigrants, including Germans, Italians, and Aleuts, also faced detention during the war. On March 18, 1942, the Federal War Relocation Authority was established again. Its mission was to take all people of Japanese descent into custody, surround them with the troops, prevent them from buying land, and again, returning them to their former homes at the close of the war. Many of those who are critical of the use of internment believe incarceration and detention to be more appropriate terms. Japanese Americans were given 4 days to about 2 weeks to settle all their affairs and gather as many of their belongings as they could carry. In many cases, individuals and families were forced to sell some or all of their property, including their businesses, within that short window of time. Conditions at the camps were spare. Internees lived in uninsulated barracks furnished only with cots and coal-burning stoves. Residents used common bathroom and laundry facilities, but hot water was usually limited. The camps were surrounded by barbed wire fences, patrolled by armed guards who had instructions to shoot anyone who tried to leave. Although there were a few isolated incidents of internees being shot and killed, as well as more numerous examples of preventable suffering, the camps generally were run humanely. People at the camps tried to establish some sense of community for themselves. The residents were allowed to live in family groups, and the internees set up schools, churches, farms, and newspapers. The children were allowed to play sports and engage in various activities. Nevertheless, the internment took its toll on Japanese Americans who spent as long as 3 years living in an atmosphere of tension, suspicion, and despair. Of the 127,000 Japanese Americans who were living in the continental U.S. at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, 112 residents resided on the West Coast. About 80,000 were second-generation Japanese, third-generation Japanese, and the rest were first-generation immigrants born in Japan who were ineligible for U.S. citizenship under U.S. law. In Hawaii, and this is really profound, which was under martial law after the attack on Pearl Harbor, more than 150,000 Japanese Americans comprised over 1/3 of the territory's population, but only 1,200 to 1,800 were incarcerated out of 150,000 Japanese residents. Now, California defined anyone with as little as 1/16 or more Japanese lineage as a person who should be incarcerated. Colonel Carl Benditson, the architect of the program, was so far as to say that anyone with 1 drop of Japanese blood qualifies for incarceration as far as he was concerned. Now, when Roosevelt authorized this Executive Order 9066, issued 2 months after Pearl Harbor was attacked, it allowed regional military commanders to designate military areas from which any and all persons may be excluded. Although the executive order, and I mentioned this a few minutes ago, did not specifically mention Japanese Americans, the authority was used to declare that all people of Japanese ancestry were required to leave Alaska, and the military exclusion zones from all of California and parts of Oregon, Washington, and Arizona, with the military exclusion, with the exception of those inmates who were being held in government camps. The detainees were not only people of Japanese ancestry, but they also included a relatively small number of people of German, Italian descent, as well as Germans who were expelled from Latin America and deported to the U.S. Approximately 5,000 Japanese Americans relocated outside the exclusion zone before March of 1942, while some 5,500 community leaders had been arrested immediately after Pearl Harbor and were put immediately into custody. The United States Census Bureau assisted the incarceration efforts by providing specific individual data on Japanese Americans. The Bureau denied its role for decades, despite scholarly evidence to the contrary, and its role became more widely acknowledged by 2007. In its 1944 decision, Korematsu versus the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the removals under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution. The court limited its decision to the validity of the exclusion orders, avoiding the issue of the incarceration of U.S. citizens without due process, but ruled on the same day in ex parte endo that a loyal citizen could not be detained, which began their release. The day before the Korematsu and endo rulings were made public, the exclusion orders were rescinded. Japanese Americans were initially barred from military service, but by 1943, they were finally allowed to join, with 20,000 serving during the war. And over 4,000 students were allowed to leave the camps to attend college. At the time, Japanese incarceration was intended to mitigate a security risk which Japanese Americans were believed to pose. The scale of the incarceration in proportion to the size of the Japanese American population far surpassed similar measures which were undertaken against German and Italian Americans who were interned due to being mostly non-citizens. Relocation was popularly supported at the time. According to a March 1942 poll conducted by the American Institute of Public Opinion, and we said in several of our episodes that we know Franklin Delano Roosevelt relied heavily on the court of public opinion to make his decisions regarding what was in the best interest of the United States. So here again, he's relying on the court of public opinion, and 93% of Americans supported the relocation of Japanese non-citizens from the Pacific Coast, whereas only 1% of the citizens of the United States opposed it. According to the same poll, 59% supported the relocation of Japanese people who were born in the country and were United States citizens already before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, whereas only 25% opposed it. From 1869 to 1924, approximately 200,000 immigrated to the islands of Hawaii, mostly laborers expecting to work on the island's sugar plantations. Now, this was during that Golden Door period that we talked about in an earlier episode. Some 180,000 went to the U.S. mainland, with the majority of them settling on the West Coast and establishing farms or small businesses. Most arrived before 1908, when the gentleman's agreement between Japan and the United States banned the immigration of unskilled laborers. A loophole allowed the wives of men who were already living in the U.S. to join their husbands. The practice of women marrying by proxy and immigrating to the U.S. resulted in a large increase in the number of what were called picture brides. As the Japanese American population continued to grow, European Americans who lived on the West Coast resisted the arrival of this ethnic group, fearing competition from it and making the exaggerated claim that hordes of Asians were keen to take over white-owned farmland and business. Isn't this sounding all too familiar with what we uncovered was the reason why FDR and Congress would not allow the refugee Jews to flee here to the United States? It was for the exact same reason. This is how the American citizens felt about allowing the Jews to come here to flee from the Nazis during World War II. And now the exact same attitude and sentiment was true about transferring not only the Japanese citizens, but any foreign-born Japanese, even if they only had 1/16 Japanese in them, were swept away to these incarceration camps. There were 7 or 8 of them, or maybe 9, throughout the United States. So just another example of the mentality and the ideology of the U.S. Again, during World War II, there's been such a consistent theme throughout the Holocaust and the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This all took place in World War II, and we're really seeing a clear picture of just how integrally involved the U.S. was in making many of the decisions that resulted in the outcome of the Holocaust and the Japanese internment camp situation. Thank you for listening.
One of the things that people don't seem to realize is that our government, under the direction of Franklin D. Roosevelt, was well aware of the bombing 8 or 9 months before it even happened. But he wanted a way to enter the war. And he knew that if he allowed the Japanese to bomb Pearl Harbor, that would give the U.S. the free ticket they needed to enter the war. But on the other hand, it really does make my blood run cold when we put citizens into an internment camp surrounded with barbed wire and soldiers and dogs. Isn't this reminiscent of what the Germans did to the Jews in Germany, Poland, France? And doesn't it make you wonder how very similar the government of the United States, which is a voted democracy, is similar to the control of Hitler, who came up through a democracy and then declared himself dictator? Please, audience, if you have an opinion on this, or you feel the cold wind blowing straight at you for some of the candidates who are thinking of running for president in 2024 with the same type of philosophy, this is something that needs to be exposed, because the thinking and the behavior that goes with it has not changed. Now we're going to hear from Betsy Wurtzel, who has 2 articles dealing with how the Jews were treated in New Jersey.
Florida.
Florida, excuse me. In Florida, which is even better than New Jersey, because in New Jersey is just the mafia. But in Florida, you have the older baby boomers settling in Florida for the last 60 years. Right?
Yes, it was a very interesting article. I don't have a computer to print it out. I don't even remember the name of the article. I got in an email through the Jewish, I think it's a genealogy something. I don't remember the name, but how the Jews came into Florida from the Spanish countries, but there was a lot of anti-Semitism throughout Florida. And I couldn't believe that they even had signs that said no Jews or dogs allowed. So they were putting Jews right along with the dogs. And when I told this to my son Josh, and he asked a very interesting question, he said, well, how would they know if you're Jewish? Which is a good point. I guess they would ask for proof or something. It just astonished me, and I was like so shocked about the behavior of people in this country and who founded this country. Now, I love America, and I'm glad I'm an American. And I know the United States isn't perfect, and I'm glad I live here. If I didn't live here, I think I'd want to live in Israel. But to discriminate like that, not only were there signs of no colors, no Negroes, I didn't know that they had signs of no Jews. But Jews weren't allowed to buy property in certain places in Florida. And my parents experienced that in our neighborhood. They had trouble getting housing. And now you're talking in the late 50s when they moved from New York to the Carteret, New Jersey. This is really an atrocity, folks. And as far as the Japanese, I have a friend who lives in California, and her mother was in one of those camps. And that's really a sad commentary on how we treated people. Another article, which Lillian sent me, bear with me because I can't read with my glasses on, is from the Washington Post. The guy's name is Nick Muroff, and it's talking about asylum seekers who, if they cross the U.S. border illegally, they are going to face the most restrictive measures to date under the Biden administration. And that was posted Tuesday, February 21st, 2023. A temporary rule will penalize asylum seekers who cross the U.S. border illegally or fail to apply for protection in other nations that they transit en route to the United States. So they really the U.S. wants the illegals to seek asylum in the other Hispanic countries instead of coming to the U.S. Bear with me. I have to take my glasses off. I can't read my own handwriting. The penalty would make, would make it more difficult to cross the border and for the illegals to come in. And Title 42, I believe, has ended or will be ending shortly. And that will cause a huge problem. I said this before, folks, and I'll give my own opinion. I am a byproduct of illegals. And I understand why people come in illegally. Sometimes they have no other choice. I'm all for immigration. I come from immigration. There needs to be better laws. There needs to be a faster way to become a citizen. And it takes it's a long process. And the process needs to be better, improved for them to become legalized. And I believe most people do want to be legalized. Thank you for listening.
I think that the United States, for better for worse, is a very good country. I'm proud to be an American. But sometimes, yes, I'm also ashamed about some of the things we do while pointing fingers at other countries and cultures while we're doing the same thing. But because we are so-called America, we're allowed to get away with it, while everybody else is not. And this is not just America's problem, it's all over the place. In any country you go to, they have bad and dirty laundry that they try to hide, but then they come out looking squeaky clean and telling the rest of the world, you're doing it all wrong. So I would like to put out a call to action to our listening audience and ask them, were your parents immigrants to this country from the 1920s all the way through World War II, and including the recent immigrants that have come in and faced discrimination, prejudice, death? When the Vietnam citizens came across and they settled in Houston, Texas, they were threatened with death by the fishermen along the coast because the Vietnamese were a lot more proficient in harvesting fish from the sea than the fishermen from Texas. Their livelihood was threatened. And so the only way that they knew was the old West tradition, kill them. And yet, when they finally pass through that phase, they're great friends and they have nothing for respect for these people. But it's that front line attitude among our people, any people. You fear them, you don't trust them, and they're going to take the food out of your kids' mouths. And we have to stop having that type of emotional backlash at people coming into our country, because goodness knows that they have every right to come here for a better life. Why? Because the United States has been saying for the last 350 years, since we separated from Britain, come to our country for a better life. See your dreams realized. Come because you will not be persecuted for your religious beliefs. And whether or not the founding fathers and the people after them really meant it or not, that's what the United States is known for. So Lisa, Betsy, and I would like your reaction, audience, of how you feel about your country in regards to letting in the immigrants, whether they're from South America, or they're from Israel, or they're from Ethiopia, or they're from the Ukraine. Let me tell you something about the Ukraine. Putin has a list of other countries he wants to invade once he's finished with the Ukraine. So if you think this is just a one-time little war with Ukraine, it isn't. He has a list like Hitler. I've always wondered what would happen if the people in Poland or Austria or Denmark or Sweden or Spain had fought back that initial onslaught into their country. What would happen? Ladies, do you want to add anything else or provide your contact information so people can get in touch with you?
Okay. I'm glad you brought that up about the initial or the original intention of the United States, because I was actually going to add that. That was what the Golden Door policy was all about, was coming to the U.S. for a better life. What happened? Because since the latter part of the 19th century, that all came to a screeching halt. And now it is 2023, and hasn't changed at all. So if you would like to send me a message regarding any of the information that I provided during this episode, my email address is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you, and I will respond to any of your comments. So thanks again for being here. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to what we have to say.
Betsy?
Hi, yes. My email is Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY 31 @gmail.com. And I want to thank everyone for listening. You could send me a note. And I just want to thank you, Lillian, Lisa, for your information, and you, Lillian, for having the show. I think that, if people would realize we're more the same than different, and if people would just, I don't know, just get along, just see the beauty in each culture and the person. Every immigration, every ethnic background faced backlash when they came. Different foods, different ways of dressing. And we would embrace it. And, you don't have to agree with someone's religion or lifestyle, but it doesn't give you the right to bully them, to humiliate them, or to kill them. Let's just shine our light, as I say in my own show, and be kind. That's what we should do. And yes, I'm a generation of the 60s and 70s, and I still believe that. Do you still believe that? Do you think that we should be kind to each other? I would like to hear from people. Thank you.
Lillian Cauldwell. My phone number has changed. I'm still waiting for my cell phone to activate itself. It's been over a week now. So until that happens, you can call me or leave a voice message at 484-755-5166 or contact me at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes this month's topic on the U.S. and the Holocaust. We will revisit it again in June. However, March is International Women's Month. So our next topic for the month of March is going to be trafficking of women and girls, not only in the United States, but overseas. So we urge you to come back and listen to our first episode next week, which will be March 10th at 3 p.m. So please come and join us. If you have any questions or opinions, please let all of us know so that we can address them. We want to thank you all very much for listening. You will hear this on all our social media sites. I'm not going to list them all, but yes, they'll be on youtube.com/Passionate World Radio. Yes, they'll be on facebook.com/Passionate World Radio. Yes, they'll be on linkedin.com/Passionate World Talk Radio. And let's not forget the website where you can hear it with the links at passionateworldtalkradio.com/blog. Thank you all very much for listening. And remember, please keep listening. Thank you.